A question that often comes up during an election year is whether we should change how we vote and how we run elections.
Highlight the principles and try to create policies that effectuate those principles. And turning around fast results is a party-neutral kind of reform that builds trust across the map. So those are the kind of things that I think of.
On this episode, we explore possible ways to reform the primary election process, focusing our discussion on how to improve the voter experience and increase public trust. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and on this episode, we turn our attention once again to the idea of election trust. Because of all the commotion and debate and controversy in recent years around our elections in this country, it's an area of significant focus for us here at Sutherland, along with many other partners throughout the nation. So today I'm very excited to bring into the conversation. Joining us remotely is Matt Germer. He's the Policy Director of the Governance Program at R Street Institute, which is a Washington, D.C. based policy think tank. Matt, thanks so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Nick, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
And we're also joined in studio by Derek Monson, who's our Chief Growth Officer here at Sutherland, also oversees our policy team, and is kind of our resident expert here in Sutherland on election policy. Derek, thanks for coming back to the show.
I'm glad to be here.
So I want to jump into the conversation, and Matt, especially put this in context. Here in Utah, many voters have recently completed their participation in the primary election process, filling out their ballots, sending them back in. We're of course, a state that is well known for having a long history of vote by mail. And I want to first kind of get a broad perspective from you. Again, as I mentioned before, because of all the controversy around voting and election policy, in your view, what is the health of this civic institution of voting and elections, broadly speaking, throughout the country these days?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. You might hear from a lot of other people that our civic health on elections in particular is in a terrible spot. And I think they've got some evidence to that effect. But I'll say it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, on the good side, we continue to see Americans turn out for elections. We had, huge turnout in 2020 in the midst of the pandemic, even as people basically did everything they could to make sure that they participated in that election. 2022 continued to see pretty good turnout around the country for a midterm election. And so on the one hand, I think the fact that we're continuing to see more and more Americans engaged in our elections is a good thing. On the other hand, this is where it's a bit more of that mixed bag. The trust in our elections is not necessarily in a healthy place across the country. And I think that there's a tendency for this to have a bit more of a partisan skew to it. From 2016 to 2020, a number of Democrats felt like our elections weren't fair or weren't electing the legitimate candidate. They had concerns over tampering from Russians or even just basic concerns we've seen now for decades that the Electoral College isn't sufficiently majoritarian, some of those things. And on the Republican side, the lack of faith in our elections is a bit more recent and is a bit more stark. Some of the polling that we've put out there across the country has shown that roughly 2/3 of Republican voters don't have confidence that Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. He won, and that has been finalized, and yet a pretty sizable majority of Republicans don't have confidence in that outcome. So with those kind of factors in mind, high turnout, but also maybe lower confidence and a bit more of a partisan swing back and forth based on who's in power, there's a lot of opportunities for improvement in our trust in elections in our country.
Derek, what do you make of this circumstance that kind of Matt outlined? It's interesting, Matt, that you say there's high turnout, but there's these questions and concerns among some sectors about trust and integrity. And it's making me think that in years past, the metric of sort of election health used to be mostly turnout. It was my recollection. So the fact that this new issue has sort of, in recent years, come on the stage so significantly. Derek, what's your take? How healthy are our institutions of voting in elections, both here in Utah in particular and nationally, as kind of Matt's alluding to?
Well, I think I tend to be more of an optimist on this kind of thing, and partly it's because my focus is mostly here in Utah, and I think overall we're doing pretty well on trust measures whether you're looking at turnout or whether you're looking at how people respond to what they feel and think about the elections. I think maybe where the concern comes in for me is what Matt said about the partisan swing that's created there, right? I mean, that's speaking to how deeply partisanship and maybe polarization and that partisan division has penetrated into more fundamental things across the country about how we view things that are essential to our self-governing republic, right? Like to our constitutional order and how we function as a society and as a country. And if all of that, for instance, if it continues kind of going down the path it's going, if all of that is simply on the whim of partisan interest, then we're in a really tough spot, And of course, there's a I think a legitimate question as to how people report on surveys, for instance, versus how they live their lives daily. They may, when a survey is asked, I don't like the guy in power or the woman in power, and so I'm going to say, I don't like X, the direction of the country or how the election went and those kinds of things. But if that ever goes beyond that to, again, kind of dictating the day-to-day of how we live our lives, we're in a really tough spot as a country. And it's really tough to decide whether we're to that point yet. I mean, it's not just a pure metric kind of situation. It's more of a read. I don't think we are, but I think we're potentially on that path, and that's where the things get concerning. We need to be able to believe in our institutions regardless of our partisan affiliation and partisan interest. And to the extent that that is not happening, which I think there is a measure to which it's not happening, we need to think about that hard, address it, and figure out how to move beyond it.
Derek, you've written recently about and spoken about this idea of even as we try to pursue reforms to our election processes, we have to start from a basic foundation of trust. That this idea that, we can and should trust our elections, that they're secure, but also let's look at areas we can improve on those. And you spoke of that recently at our election trust forum, and I want to bring you and Matt in a second and kind of get your take on an element that came up of that in terms of the voter experience. But briefly, Derek, can you expand on that a little bit? This idea that how do we do both these things at the same time? How do we both say, yes, our elections are secure, we should approach it from that perspective, but also there's some things we can fix and improve? How do you do both simultaneously?
I think a lot of it comes down to two things. One, how those who have a broad reach, community influencers, people running for office who have a following, who have the cameras on them, as it were, and are what they say is going to go out there, how they speak about and approach these things. So if they're doing so in a way that raises legitimate questions around election policy and election administration, but with a feel and a direction of we need to reform and improve these things, as opposed to these things are corrupt, they're rigged, we can't trust them. If it's the former, then we're okay, because it's a constructive contribution to the issue and to the area. Nothing is perfect. No election system is perfect, so there's going to be ways we can improve it. A great example of this is actually, in my view, is what happened in New York in their mayoral primary, right? There were some concerns. It was a ranked choice voting election, and there was an error made in how they tabulated ballots. They put in test ballots into the final counts when they started reporting those things out, and that was a mistake. And people caught on to it, and I was on social media quite a bit, but when you read the commentary about it, it's constantly towards this board, the election board needs to be reformed, and they've had some struggle for a while. We need to improve that system. It wasn't this is wholly corrupt and we can't trust it and we just need to burn it down and I'm the one who won and so you should make me the winner anyway, which is kind of how we saw in the presidential elections. I was more of that kind of, we shouldn't trust the system. I won, the election was stolen. And even if in those cases the outcome changes, people aren't going to now trust the election system, right? They're actually going to trust it less and think they have to go and maybe completely burn the whole thing down. And so again, how our elected officials and candidates respond is critical. But then the second element of that is how do we respond to those messages? Do we look at them and say, hey, this guy or gal who's running for office that I like is raising questions, therefore I'm skeptical and I'm not really trusting the system anymore? Or are we saying, okay, well, that's interesting. If they're bringing that up, I like them as a candidate. I should listen to that. But there's other information out here that seems to contradict what they're saying. So I shouldn't just take everything they say at face value. And so if we respond in that more rational, kind of reasonable way, which requires us to have sources of information that allow us to do that, then I think, again, we can move forward in a constructive way in fixing problems.
Matt, I want to get your take on the national scale, because Derek alluded to something, this idea of sort of trying to view this issue through the lens of the voter. How do voters perceive this? How do they experience this? And in fact, at our recent election trust forum that we held here in Utah, we'll include the links in the show notes for anyone who missed that and wants to go back and kind of get a recap, see some of the videos and material from that. But one of the concepts that was brought up in that discussion was this idea of how important the voter experience is, and this idea that for voters to feel like they can trust an election, a really important part of that is just their experience being a voter, submitting their ballot, waiting in line, whatever their experience is. And because we recently had this primary process, as I mentioned, Utah voters engaging in their civic duty in that way, I want to ask for your perspective on that, specifically with respect to the primary process. How do you view, the primary process in this country with respect to the voter experience? And even though that hasn't been as much of where there's been focus on some of these discussions around election security, it's sort of the first essential step of obviously getting the nominees to the general election. So what do you make of just the general health and process of the primary election today, given that we just concluded that here in Utah?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I appreciate it. And I also want to reflect for just a moment on something Derek brought up, which is voter experience is both one part what it's like for you as the voter to cast your ballot and maybe watch as the results come in, but it's also one part as news consumers and what we're seeing and hearing about the election, both locally and across the country. I guess to expand a bit about that local and across the country, there's a trend across our country that people have far more positive views on their election locally, and then slightly less positive views on their elections within their state, and even less positive views on elections around the country. It's similar to the dynamic that we see for congressional approval. No one likes Congress, but everyone loves their Congress member. Elections have a similar dynamic in that way, and as a result, it's important that that first local level hands-on experience with elections is good, because that's really the best opportunity to leave a good experience behind for each voter. It's something I prioritize. I enjoyed it in Super Tuesday this year of working as a poll worker in my state of residence, North Carolina. I know in states like Utah, you have a little bit more vote by mail, but for anyone out there who does a lot more of that in-person election day voting, would absolutely encourage folks to serve as a poll worker in those instances and help their neighbors out. But when it comes to voting experience, and particularly in primaries, I think it's shaped by something we already started talking about on this episode, which is turnout. Turnout in primaries is very low across the country. I think we're looking at something like 30 to 35% nationally in turnout. States that use vote by mail have a slightly higher average turnout. Some states where they have primary runoff elections after the first round of the primary, they do some kind of head-to-head showdown in tight races, like I mentioned where I live here in North Carolina. We have primary runoffs. Sometimes they can see turnout as low as 5%. And so in those kinds of races, voter experience, how many voters are you actually touching? And how is that shaping their impression of the elections? And maybe as another complicating factor there too, how does that shape the legitimacy of those elections? If 95% of eligible voters aren't participating in that election, and one candidate emerges the winner, are they able to really claim a mandate? Can they build anything from that? Is there a certain element of democratic legitimacy built into that kind of system? But I'd say the other real factor when it comes to primaries, and we could get into this as we go, has to do with the structure of primaries. Who is allowed to participate? How do they participate? Who are they voting for? Those kind of factors really impact the way that voters feel like they're being heard, and the way that they're able to reflect back on our representative government and say, is this person that is supposed to be representing me and my neighbors, are they actually representing me and my neighbors if a good portion of my neighbors weren't even allowed to participate?
Matt, let's dig into that for a second, because you talk about the structure, and you've done some work on this, looking at essentially different ways that states can conduct their primary elections. And I want to get into some of the elements of how this touches on the role of political parties. But first, not every state does it the same way with respect to a primary election. Here in Utah, we have a caucus convention system. We have closed partisan primaries. But let's give our listeners kind of a broader understanding of there actually are quite a few different ways to do this. What have you seen around the country? How do different states conduct their primary elections in different ways? Can you give us just a quick rundown on that?
Sure, and maybe framing this in the context of maybe the most closed and restrictive system to the most open system can kind of help as listeners work their way through this. States like Utah, and there's only a handful of them that use kind of this caucus convention style, might be in some ways the most restrictive because folks need to show up to a very specific place in order to participate in that primary election. You need to be registered with the party and an active member of the party and satisfy another set of requirements there. Those have perhaps the lowest turnout because very literally just fewer people are permitted to engage in the process. Slightly more open in a traditional primary system. I think how most Americans have thought of primaries, you have each party operating a primary election where they decide which of their candidates moves forward to the general. In 10 states, those primaries are closed. They're only open to registered party voters. They're not open to independents. They're not open to members of other parties. This style is the traditional system in America, but it's now a minority system. Only 10 states have a very rigorous closed partisan primary. Another 9 states, not including Utah, which I think has some unique factors for Utah, as I mentioned, with the caucus and convention system too. But 9 states allow parties to decide themselves whether to allow independent voters to participate. These are known as partially closed. I think of a state like Idaho, where I believe the Republicans traditionally have said only Republicans can participate in our primary, but the Democrats opened their party primary system to independent voters based on the party's decision. 4 states are also closed in some ways, but they do allow crossover voting. So they'll allow independents to vote and they'll allow members of other parties to participate in the primary. But in doing so, voting in that primary counts as re-registering as a member of that new party. So it's not a completely no strings attached way to participate in the primary. 7 states allow independents to choose which primary they want to participate in, and it does not re-register them in doing so, but they don't allow crossover voting. This is a state like where I live in North Carolina, where if I were an independent voter, can go to the polling place on a primary day and tell the folks at the check-in table which of the ballots I'd like to vote that day, and I could remain an independent going forward. Finally, 15 states use what's known as an open primary, where it's open to everyone. Doesn't matter whether you're a member of any registered party or an independent, you can participate, but it is still a partisan primary. It's still picking which Republican or which Democrat moves on forward, and voters have to pick, do they want to vote the Republican ballot, the Democratic ballot, the Libertarian ballot, etc. The most kind of newest and exploratory form of primaries, there's 5 states that use a nonpartisan primary, and they're a bit unique as you move across the country. 2 of them, California and Washington, have a top 2 system where all candidates, regardless of party, show up on the ballot. Voters can pick from among them as they go, and the top 2 candidates, regardless of party, in each race advance to the general election where they square off head to head. Alaska does something somewhat similar, except instead of top 2, they've got 4 candidates who move forward to the general election, and there voters use ranked choice voting in the general to pick from among them. And a couple of states have unique systems, Louisiana and Nebraska. Nebraska's is technically a nonpartisan system, and since it's nonpartisan, you can't have a party primary, so instead they use that. And Louisiana has perhaps one of the most unique forms where their general election in November is actually a primary. And if no one candidate achieves 50%, then they have a runoff following up after that soon after. So they don't necessarily engage with primaries the way the rest of America does months in advance of the November election.
Matt, that's quite a thorough rundown. I'm sure many of our listeners will be surprised that there's that much variety in how states conduct their primary processes. In broad strokes, do you see pros and cons of different approaches? I mean, again, if we're imagining, okay, we're looking at how we do things here in Utah, other folks in other states are looking at how they do things. There's always that question of, can we do things better? Should we do things differently? I mean, that comes up often, of course. As people are grappling with that question and they hear about this slate of different approaches in different states, are there just general pros and cons of different methods that we should be aware of before we're jumping into this conversation of primary reform?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And it really does, as you mentioned, is a kind of pro and con thing. It's a question of trade-offs. What matters to you as a policymaker or as a voter? So thinking through those, a partisan primary, maybe that's the first division. Should all candidates appear on one ballot together, like in California or Washington or others? Or should people be picking among the Republicans or among the Democrats to move those forward? The implications of that mean that often in a partisan primary, candidates are running to be the most partisan. They're trying to appeal to those voters who want to participate in that party's primary election. Does that ultimately mean that they are creating a campaign that is broadly popular? Sometimes in a highly partisan district, it can be, but in closer districts or in more moderate districts, it adds a complication to that effect. Similarly, whether or not the party primary is open to voters has similar impacts. If you close a partisan primary and only allow registered voters of that party to participate, you're heightening how partisan the election now is. There isn't really a need for a candidate to reach out to independents or to potentially reach out to voters of another party, but who may be interested, either may be interested in participating in that one election, or may be interested in switching parties and maybe realigning themselves in the political system. And so if you keep a party primary closed, you shut those doors. If you open them, you open them. But on the other side of that, the trade-off to that is the candidate who might emerge from a partisan primary, but in an open state where anyone can participate, may not be, how do I put that? Like to the most partisan interested voters, may not be the best representative of a partisan candidate. So it really comes down to the trade-offs for you.
Derek, I want to get your take either how you view kind of the excellent layout that Matt just gave. How would we apply those kinds of questions or thoughts to Utah and what we see going on here? Of course, that there was a lot of controversy and debate right after the caucus convention system, just because of some of the issues with how it ran logistically, as well as in terms of turnout, another thing that Matt mentioned, or the broader question of just in general how we elect people here in Utah. Is there anything that stands out to you from what he just said that you think we need to keep top of mind here? Or in general, your thoughts on, do you agree with Matt that those are kind of the right trade-offs to think about with those different forms of doing primaries?
Yeah, I think one interesting thing about Utah, right, is we have a unique blend of the options that Matt laid out. We have a caucus convention path to get on the primary ballot, which is a closed primary, a closed partisan primary, or you can gather signatures, which is kind of more typical. A lot of states use that to get on a primary ballot. And there's a long history and kind of controversial political history as to why Utah has that system. So as people and policymakers here in Utah consider how we nominate people based on this last round of caucus night and how state conventions went, that is all part of what has to be considered, is that history and what unique nuances Utah has as you look to reform what Utah has. So, with the trade-offs, I do think what Matt said is very pertinent. What do we want our primaries to look and feel like? Do we want it to be about how partisan the candidate is, and that's the kind of system we're going to elevate, or rather, we're going to create a system that elevates that kind of candidate? Or do we want to create a system that reflects more candidates that are more broadly representative than the kind of hardest version of the partisan interest? And one way I think we can do that is by looking to sources of principle, because it really becomes complicated. If you start to talk about these things too much, it becomes, well, what person do you support? This person's running, and I want that person to win, and so I want the primary system to let that person win. But that's kind of a narrow way to look at how we nominate and elect people. And so I think the wiser move is to look for sources of principle. And we have that in how our Constitution was advocated and defended in things like the Federalist Papers. And one of the important principles they articulated there is that elections were supposed to be one of the kind of the last and maybe most important check on how people might govern. Do they govern in the interest of a small group of people or a faction, as they would have called it, or do they govern in the interest of the broadest group of people possible, the broadest segment of society? And in as much as we are structuring our primaries to promote candidates who will govern in the broadest interests of the broadest set of good or set of interests and kind of measures of well-being of society, then we're pushing in the right direction. And which system does that the best? Well, that's a that's a difficult, complicated question, and I think there's going to be differing opinions. But I think what this last round of caucus convention and this current primary debate is revealed is raising the question whether that caucus convention system does that or not. And there's a case to be made that it doesn't. And the question then becomes, well, which one does? And that's where we really need to have a deeper conversation.
Matt, I want to get your take, especially kind of with your national lens, because to me, the question of how we run elections in the primary process, that stage, whether it's, again, caucus convention, primary, the various kind of primaries that you outlined, and especially because, as you articulated, there are different levels, and as Derek added to, different levels of sort of leaning into the value or lack thereof of partisanship, of maybe political parties generally. So to me, this question of how we choose people at this stage before we get to the general election hinges on this general question of the role or the value of political parties today. And I'm very curious to your thoughts there. How do you view those two things interweaving, and how, to what extent should that inform and influence how we look at something like primary reform?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because parties are an inherent part of our system. We've got a representative government, and in order to get people elected, people need to organize, coalitions need to be built, ideological platforms have to be created. Whether those are completely synergistic it doesn't have to be the case. We just need entities out there who help gather voters together and rally them around candidates to get something done. And political parties function in that way. And they've been in place in our country since its founding, essentially. Despite, I think, George Washington's warnings about factions, we immediately saw factions as soon as he stepped down, and we had our next presidential election. So political parties are inevitable. They're designed to get people elected, to wrangle that coalition of voters. We can't ignore them. They also function as fundraisers. They help voters identify maybe which candidate they might prefer as they're gathering information about the candidates. So it's important to keep them in mind as part of the system. But I think it's also valuable to remember that their role in our political environment has changed over time. Before the era of primaries, parties were the ones elevating a single candidate to stand for election. And that kind of primary might be done in a convention style or in the smoke-filled rooms that were often discussed as a reason for why we now have primary elections. But at this point, parties don't necessarily do that same kind of very involved blessing of an individual candidate. Utah notwithstanding, around the rest of the country where they're very heavily reliant upon the primary system, parties really just function as a way for voters to come together and say, this is the party that I guess I prefer, or a set of ideas that I prefer. Let's pick which candidate we want to stand for those ideas in the general election. But they don't have to serve just that purpose. In states like Washington or California or Alaska, where all parties appear on the ballot, parties can continue to gather together. They can bless a candidate as their, chief candidate that they want to make sure they support, but they don't necessarily need a partisan primary to do that. They can continue to be that kind of coalition building and endorsing function without that. So I think it's important to recognize parties exist. We need to grapple with them, but that our primary system right now is designed around them, but it's a little out of date. The primaries were created in order to address those smoke-filled rooms, but it's now been nearly 100 years since we've seen them proliferate around the country, and the purpose has changed from ensuring public input to the primary system to now really primaries just function to winnow down candidates so that it's a manageable amount for the general election. And in that case, the primary system might be ripe for reform.
Derek, anything to add to that, what Matt just said? I mean, your thoughts on that question of sort of the role and the value of political parties, how we should be looking at that today, and also just in general, how does that then lead into, and I'm going to ask you the same question, Matt, but lead into this idea of, well, what should the sort of guiding principles be as we consider primary reform, I guess broader election reform, but in this case, primary reform. And the one kind of wrench I want to throw in as well, just Matt, because you mentioned coalition building. I've been reading Yuval Levin's new book, American Covenant, that's all about the Constitution and his argument that actually the U.S. Constitution is the thing that can heal our divisions and sort of bring us back together today so we can get back onto good governance as a country. But he talks about coalition building and how the Constitution sort of forces you to have coalitions and to negotiate between different coalitions. So it's just very top of mind for me. And Derek, I'm curious to your thoughts, the role or value of political parties generally, how that should factor into the discussion about primary reform, and those two things together, can that somehow equip us to be better or maybe regain this lost art of building and managing coalitions to get to that sort of broad interest being represented in our elections?
Well, I think a key question around political parties is, what do we mean when we say the party? Because it just turns out there are different segments of political parties, and we kind of all just put them together into this term, the party, and we never really examine what that means, and that has an important influence on what we think about primaries. So, for example, is the party primarily the kind of designated leadership, a central committee, a chairperson of the party? Because if that's the party, then a certain type of primary is going to reflect their interests and their desires. Or is the party the broad kind of number of registered partisan voters in whether it's Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Green Party, all the different parties? Is that what the party is? Is it the total membership? Because if that's what the party is, then a different primary is likely called for to represent the interests of those people. And you see that actually playing out here in Utah. In the last round of primaries previous to this year, I should say like 4 years ago, right, when you had people being nominated out of convention and then those people going to a primary, oftentimes the numbers reverse themselves. The candidate that won 60% of the delegates at convention got 30% of the actual primary vote. And so the interests of those groups are different, but we glob them all together and call them the party. And that confuses then what we're trying to figure out when we talk about primary form and how we structure our primaries. Should it reflect the leadership? Should it reflect the membership? And that's a question we just have to get clear on. And I think then it points to these questions of what primary form should be. Is it useful or not? Because if our system currently, our current system in Utah kind of is a mix, right? The conventions tend to reflect the leadership. The primaries tend to reflect the membership. And of course, the membership is the final say. If there's multiple candidates and they both get to the primary, it's going to be the membership who decides. And some people don't like that. They want to see people come in a convention be the winners, period, end of story. And so we have this ongoing debate about that. And we need to understand what exactly do we want our primaries to represent. And again, I think we come back to our constitutional principles there, that if as they said, if elections are meant to provide a check on ambition and faction and things like that, then representing a broader group of people is kind of more in line with that principle than a narrower set of, say, a leadership of a party. And if that then points to a set of solutions and excludes some others.
Matt, I want to get to reforms in the couple of minutes we have left, but real quick, I want to ask you that same question that kind of Derek brought up of what is the political party? Leadership, membership? Do you have a thought on that? How do we define that before we can get to this idea of reform? And then I want to get into some of the specific general policy reforms you'd recommend. So what is the political party?
Yeah, I think Derek brings up something important, because I think to most Americans, the party is often a mix of the candidates, the voters, and the actual structure, the corporation that exists that is the party. That might be the central committees or might be precinct officers and the rest. It is a mix, and the way that we treat it in our country is a mix. I think one important thing to note about political parties is that they are private organizations. This has been backed up in the U.S. Supreme Court. They are entitled to First Amendment associational rights about who identifies as part of the party. But there's a policy factor that I think comes in when you raise the fact that they are private organizations, which is right now all across the country we are using public funds to fund primaries for these private organizations and limiting who can participate in them. And I find that fascinating. Utah is a somewhat unique situation with conventions that aren't necessarily, I don't believe, public funded. I think the party does put those together, but we end up with this complication around the rest of the country where millions and millions of dollars of public monies are spent on private elections. And so when we talk about different principles that we might think of when it comes for improvements to our system, if Utah's looking to move out of the convention caucus-based system into something else, I would encourage that principle of not spending public money on a private function as being something that is grappled with.
Well, Matt, as we start to wrap up, broadly speaking, when you look at reforms, either yes on the primary level, but even if you want to expand this out to kind of general election reforms, of some of your research where you've talked about like how ballots are returned, the timing and processing. I mean, what are things that you think need to be top of mind for any elected leader, any policymaker or administrator, whether here in Utah or other states, as we look at how to improve or reform our election system, again, primary or general? What are some top things that come to mind for you that we should be thinking about?
I think something that a lot of folks who work in economics think about, which is incentives. Really, it should be the number one thing that comes to our mind. The way that we create the rules will impact the way that the game is played. And that's true when it comes to elections. It's true when it comes to sports. If you change the value of a field goal or a touchdown in football, players and coaches will come up with a new game plan and execute the game differently. Right now, as we've talked about, we've got relatively low turnout primaries that ultimately across the country prove to be the determinative election. I think this is particularly true for offices like Congress, where I believe our friends at Unite America came up with a figure that in 2022, 8% of Americans elected something like 83% of Congress. And now as we're into 2024 and the primary season is still underway across the country, I think something like 5% of Americans have already decided the result of 52% of congressional races. If that's the case, politicians know that, and they will run campaigns and they will govern, recognizing that they don't really need broad support from across their constituents. They just need enough support from whatever it takes to win in that primary election. So the number one thing I think that should be in mind is that incentives matter. And so similarly, I guess, relating back to a couple of previous points, we should recognize that political parties are private organizations. And so if we're spending public dollars on them, we need to take that very seriously. And we should also recognize that parties themselves are an inevitable part of the system. So we need to make sure that whatever solutions that we're promoting recognize that we do have the need for coalition building, fundraising, voter identity, to recognize which candidates they want to prefer. These are all factors that need to be grappled with.
And then Matt, how do you turn in that? I think that's a really good framework of sort of here are questions or principles we need to pursue. I do want to ask you about sort of the mechanics of this, and especially as you mentioned, as we've talked a lot about here, Utah being such a prominent vote by mail state, there have been some questions around sort of the deadlines by which people need to return their ballots, how quickly those are tabulated and results announced. Kind of going back to one of our earlier questions about the voter experience, and again, I think you articulated well that it's not just how you vote, it's when you're at home or out and about and you're seeing coverage of this in the mainstream press and on social media. So let's say you send in your ballot here in Utah and then you're watching as things are discussed on primary election day or general election day and having questions, well, why does it take so long to get these results? Or can you talk about some of those specific reforms? And do you think some changes in that area would actually help improve trust in our elections?
I do. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. So I think having quicker results is healthier for our country. It's healthier for our political culture. I think many people tend to view election day as, when the polls close, they want results immediately. Part of that's just our culture of immediacy and inability to be patient with almost anything. But having quicker results would also reduce that window in which maybe conspiracy theories start to pop up. And as folks are just kind of sitting on their hands waiting for results. So there are a number of ideas that can help on that front. For states that do have robust vote by mail, like Utah, making sure that ballots that are received in advance of the election can be pre-processed. It doesn't necessarily have to mean counting them, but it means if you've got a signature matching requirement or some kind of voter ID requirement that exists across the country where you're aligning driver's license numbers, to do those kinds of procedures in advance of election day so that once the polls close, you can just run the ballots through the machines. I don't think many Americans appreciate how much time it actually takes to do that kind of processing for each individual ballot, since it's not necessarily something a machine can do well at this point. Those signature matching exercises have to be done by humans. I think similarly for states that again, kind of sticking to vote by mail, because it does present a delay problem when it comes to getting results out. Requiring that ballots be in hand on election day really helps to reduce the lag for getting results. State where I used to live, a couple of the states I've used to live in heavily rely on vote by mail, Oregon and Washington, and both of them allow for ballots to be turned in and counted so long as they're postmarked on election day. The problem there is that it can take until Thursday or Friday for a majority of those ballots to actually arrive to the county polling places. And in some cases, it can take weeks after the election for all the ballots to arrive. That can be very frustrating for voters, and in particularly divisive and contentious elections, raises grounds for whatever kind of shenanigans people want to allege. And it happens on both sides of the aisle. I think is a fascinating little quirk. 2020, most Americans are now familiar, I think, with the idea that Democrats did better with vote by mail across the country. But prior to 2020, Republicans used to do better with vote by mail across the country. And all of that is just to say the partisan impact of these things swings over time. As Derek pointed out before, the more important thing is to highlight the principles and try to create policies that effectuate those principles. And turning around fast results is a party neutral kind of reform that builds trust across the map. So those are the kind of things that I think of.
Derek, what jumps out to you? That we're almost at time, and I want to have more conversations about this. And Matt, you bring such a good perspective to all these conversations here in Utah nationally. But Derek, from what Matt just laid out, those reforms, is there anything you heard that you said, hey, we should jump on this here in Utah? We're already doing this. What should be top of mind from that list of possible reform ideas?
Well, I think the things that Matt's talking about, a lot of which Utah is already doing pretty well. But so I think the things I would add to the list that maybe Utah can do more of is proactive communication of things that will engender trust, not because they're just a message, but because they're substantive and of value. So, for example, we do audits every election cycle on the machines that tabulate ballots. Run test ballots through. We know what the results are supposed to be. See if they got the right results after elections are over. Grab a random batch of votes, hand count them, see what the machine produced of that batch of votes, and make sure that those things align. We test them. They're called pre-election, post-election audits. We don't do a great job, I think, of communicating to people like we do in a lot of other areas. We've done these things, and here's the results. So it's not just trust us. It's a matter of saying, for example, in Utah, we communicate every time your property is about to be reassessed, and if there's a increase in your property tax, you get a notification in the mail saying your county government, your city government is thinking to increase, or your school district is thinking to increase your property taxes, or if they're not, here's your assessment, here's what your new tax value is. We have ways of communicating to people on important issues regularly. What would it take simply to have counties and cities communicate via email, if nothing else, to voters saying, we just ran our pre-election audit, here's the results. We just ran our post-election audit, here's the results. In a way that creates a new source of information for voters, that when a candidate comes out saying, these results are fraudulent, if that's what they say, then you can kind of check it against, well, if they were fraudulent, was it the machines? And if the machines are counting things the right way, then where's the fraud coming from? So it changes the dynamic, I think, in a way that actually bolsters through transparency and openness, based on substance, based on facts, trust in elections in a way you can say, you know what, this losing candidate is raising questions about what they think, did or didn't happen in elections, but we know what was kind of checked and what that suggests about their comments, and so that's one thing. I think proactive communication, and generally just being transparent. I think county clerks in Utah, generally speaking, do a good job of bringing voters into the process. If they want to come observe vote counting, if they want to observe how the process works, you don't just have to be a member of a campaign to be able to do that. And so continuing to promote those efforts and kind of welcome people to observe the process, understand all the different checks that happen through signature matching and tracking of ballots with barcodes and things like that, to make sure that the ballot you get and that you put in the mail or in a drop box or drop off at the election center is the one that's going to be counted for you, and the only vote that's going to be counted for you. So continuing to promote those efforts would also be valuable.
Well, Derek and Matt, want to thank you, and Matt, we'll have to have you back because there's a lot more in detail that we could get into, but thanks for lending your time and expertise on this issue here on Defending Ideas, and thanks for everything you do at our street and the issues you work on to try and make a difference across the country. Just really appreciate your time and your insights on this with us here on Defending Ideas.
And thank you so much for having me, and I've loved the work that Sutherland has been doing. And as a quick shout out to the people of Utah, you may not know this, but you really are leaders to the rest of the country when it comes to civility and a healthy political culture. Again, you may not always feel it on the ground, but the rest of us look to you and are looking to model your ways.
Oh, thank you, Matt. That's much appreciated. We're going to take a quick break. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, there are just a few key takeaways from our discussion today that I think we can keep top of mind if we ever end up in a discussion about voting and election policy. From our guests today, these are the things that stood out to me. Number one, it's important that we focus on the fact that the voter experience and transparency of information can both really have an impact on public trust. So any reforms should take those kinds of things into account. Number two, we should recognize that we can always strive to improve things, but also recognizing that we're starting from a foundation of effectiveness and trust and good management of our elections, especially here in Utah. But we should always be exploring ways we can improve the system, again, to have a better voter experience, more public trust, and ways that can elevate and enhance our elections in this state and beyond. And number three, the role of political parties in the primary election process and throughout our politics are an important question that should be part of the discussion about any potential reforms to this process. Well, that will do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. I hope that you have enjoyed this conversation. If you liked what you heard today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can access this and previous conversations. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, any of the major platforms. Wherever you get your shows, just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube at the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel, make sure to subscribe and click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, you can access all of that and more at defendingideas.org. And if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this on important topics we face in our state and nation, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.